I want to start by thanking a few people so that we don't forget to do that. I want to thank Diana Duque, who has been the graphic designer. She's a student in the MA Design Studies program. Diana, where are you? Where is she? She's over there. She's responsible for the beautiful visuals, the brochure, the design of the playing cards we had last night at the Unruly Feast. And I want to thank her for the hard work that she's put into helping us making this a sort of a design visual experience. Woo! And I want to thank my co-organizers, but I also want to thank the staff of the School of Arts and Design, History and Theory, Daniel Bowers, who's been dealing with the unruliness of the logistics of organizing this, Savannah Kustra, woo! Our student volunteers, student workers, Rachel Hunikut, and am I forgetting someone? I'm sure I'm forgetting one person. All the staff and students, thanks so much. And thank you all for joining us today. The third panel is about rule breaking. Of course, these three different themes, rule making, rule changing, rule breaking, as we've seen, sort of blend into one another. You know, in order to bring about change, maybe you need to break some rules or reinvent them. And in the act of changing a rule, you're actually creating something new. You're setting a new norm or a new standard or challenging existing ways of doing or modes of speaking about things. And so there's something creative and something that then gets stabilized. And it is these sort of moments, these ways of looking at these processes that motivated the organization of this conference, this sort of intricate relationship between design processes, design use, appropriation, how design conditions but also enables our daily lives, our human interactions, and is also normative and leading to, I would even claim, formation of ideologies and sometimes very narrow-minded ways of looking at the world. And so this third panel is very dear to me because it's about hacking, it's about activism, it's about going full front, breaking the wall, asking questions. So we're going to move from the power of do-it-yourself fabrication processes and the questions that they raise in terms of legal or ethical discussions, and Otto von Busch is going to be talking about luck picking. Yeah, so luck picking as a designerly activity perhaps, and a do-it-yourself kind of mode of action. And then we're going to look into how the digital era has maybe transformed or actually challenges the authorship that a designer might have over his products, and Andrea Lips is going to be talking about that. And then we're going to move into a more kinky, more subversive, more provocative look at avant-garde fashion design with Charlene Lau, who's going to be talking to us about pornographic images, pornographic acts, pornographic ideas, and how they have infiltrated our understanding of fashion. And finally, Ken Wark, Mackenzie Wark, is going to be talking about this very fascinating idea, in my view, of how concepts, in terms of philosophical ideas, philosophical concepts, could be understood not as ways of assessing or ways of qualifying a design, but as designed in and of themselves. How do we design concepts? And so I'm really looking forward to that, and this will be the last panel. And so I will invite Otto right away. Thank you very much.
Hello. Okay. Yes, so I will start thinking about or talking about something that I just sort of started revisiting a little from my old thesis, which was about sort of hacking and fashion, and I'm sort of trying to sort of figure out a little what is going on in the Making Center, because I'm in the advisory committee there, and it's sort of fascinating because there's something about the Crystal Palace about the Making Center. I mean, of course, this is also something that Vicky has been working on, sort of how labor today is exposed. The whole idea to produce value is to produce or to show off labor. But I think there's something about sort of how what do the Making Center do? What are we supposed to do? Under what sort of regime are we working in the Making Center, in that sense? So what sort of making are we thinking about as we're not doing perhaps industrial design and these kind of things, mass production in the same way, but there's some sort of reconceptualization of making and production. And to me, coming out of this kind of Swedish Sloyd system where there's a big emphasis on handcraft in education, there's something happening between here. Sort of, what is it that in shop class, in sort of the act of making, that we're sort of doing that is perhaps different than from sort of traditional lecturing and learning in the traditional sense. One of the founders of the Sloyd movement, Otto Solomon, opened the NAS seminar outside of Gothenburg, and where I did my PhD, but much later. And the idea with Sloyd exactly was this, that it's another type of education. This is at the same time as public education sort of comes to many European countries, but rather sort of repeating what the teacher teaches, or preaches rather, because of course they're sort of run still through the church. The idea was sort of, what other types of skills is making doing for us? But of course, there's also something when these are some of the early manuals in English. A student of Otto Solomon moves here to America and to Boston and starts working at the Bennett Street School to teach American teachers shop class, according to the Sloyd system. But this idea that by making, we also become good. So there's something about how the Making Center at Parsons, it's good. There's something about, it is. I mean, of course, it's very nice being there, but there's also such virtue there. And that, I think, is fascinating because it also resonates a little with the sort of the capabilities approach that has been so strong within development studies and things. This idea that if I'm able to do things, that is sort of a micro-freedom. I shouldn't really challenge the state and ask for freedom or something like that, but it's like this kind of small micro-freedoms, And this is fascinating because also, of course, thinking back about Sloyd class when I was growing up, the first thing the boys were doing were ninja stars. So there's something about what the access to a shop does. The boys would do baseball bats, ninja stars, and this, so this whole idea that making sort of also has sort of a subversive, a little lure in also doing a little sort of rule-breaking things just by the very act of accessibility in that sense. It's almost like swear words, but it's like, as soon as we learn them, there's also something challenging in the possibility of freedom, if we want to sort of reclaim a little of the capabilities approach in that sense, that is actually, it allows me, it cannot really control everything I can do with my hands in that sense. And of course, this sort of comes back to issues such as, of the challenges of the stage. So home taping is killing music, and of course then the Dead Kennedys produce a tape which has one side free for people to actually do this, to actually remake. It's a challenge to the record companies by actually offering them free space on their cassettes for people to do the same thing. The most perhaps controlled environments where making is of course forbidden is prisons. But of course there's a continuous stream of books in the sense of different types of prison inventions. This is from Temporary Services in Chicago about what inventions do people do in prisons in these kind of extremely controlled environments. So making is always a struggle of some sort. What can I do? What am I allowed to do? What is sort of going on with what my hands, what this capability of actually doing things? This fascinates me because this is HDK, the school that I did my PhD and my studies. And this is a sort of invented postcard from 2001 where the famous Gothenburg riots happened in the G8 for some of these summits, where the police fired bullets at demonstrators the first time since 1930 or something like that. So there was this kind of the collapse of the Swedish model, of the consensus model and things. It was a big sort of thing, and it's just on the street next to the School of Crafts. So I thought it was fascinating in the sense of what was the tension going on here? And there was a demonstrator at school who sort of said something that was fascinating for me, because he said that what was so mind-blowing at these demonstrations was that for the first time in my life, I touched power when I fought the police. Because otherwise the system is always intangible. But there I was bloody because I had forced myself against powers. So as a citizen, that was sort of a revelation for him. And I thought it was really fascinating, and this is something I'm now trying to sort of grasp a little, coming back to sort of making in that sense. You know, could we talk about that there's certain kind of civic crafts that are somehow in some sort of negotiation with sort of statecraft? And statecraft is sort of very expanded, but sort of the control of certain capabilities versus certain capabilities that wants to break free, in a sense, you know, that sort of happen in the making, or could happen in making, and there's other forces that try to sort of limit them. And of course, we can sort of identify certain kind of axes in such a landscape, if we want to say so, you know, but sort of, you know, certain kind of making is about homesteading and sort of, you know, counterculture, about sort of independence, moving out in the forest, this kind of, you know, we have certain ideas of what making, building my own house, the sort of a classic Walden idea. And then sort of, it sort of comes up towards much more sort of an entrepreneurship where making means innovation. Making means exactly setting up my own company. And of course, in the long end, on, if you want to say so, how Make Magazine and the Maker Faire is paid partly by DARPA, by actually the state, to produce, invent drones. You know, so actually, the sort of the act of making and entrepreneurship is actually control, becoming more and more part of the state apparatus in order to wage war, in a sense. Of course, the sort of the connection between war and making is not something new. You know, some of these kind of best-selling survival books, so sort of, you know, outdoor books are sort of done by special forces people, you know. So one of these kind of exactly bestsellers, millions of copies, is the SAS Survival Handbook, which of course was extremely popular after the Rambo movies, you know, where everybody had a Rambo knife, which has the survival stuff inside the handle and these kind of things. It was practically sort of unusable because it would break, because it's a stupid kind of knife, but it was sort of cool to sort of have survival inside the knife, sort of, you know, and then this kind of special bow, something. You know, and of course, the Anarchist Cookbook is sort of a classic sort of confirmation of forbidden knowledges in that sense, you know, that you should not be knowing in that sense. But of course, there's also these kind of bestsellers about how to kill people and these kind of things, also often coming out of special forces people. This is something that has fascinated me because when I grew up in Sweden, and there would be this distribution of manuals if the war comes. The end of the phone book would have 15 pages what to do when the war, if the war comes, it was said, but it was basically that the war was going to come, and this was up to the 80s. Of course, it started with sort of, you know, how to evacuate, then sort of how to protect yourself against biochemical warfare, and then in the end, there would also be the free war, which is a fascinating connection, because there's a, it basically means guerrilla warfare, and this is also when I did my military service, this is how the exercises always end. You do sort of organized warfare as a unit first, but then it's sort of taken for granted that the unit will collapse, and you will have to resort to guerrilla warfare. And of course, the Swiss army and those kind of things, you know, the whole idea is that the defense is a total defense where it's totally based on mass mobilization in that sense. You know, so the idea is basically there's a decentralized warfare. This was really fascinating because, you know, growing up, at the end of all the phone numbers, there would be these kind of almost war manuals, you know, that there was something, and it ended up being called the free war, whatever. So fascinating, and exactly, this was in the early 80s. So there would be these kind of exercises. We would evacuate the city, you know, we would go on buses from school, and so, oh, the wind, whatever, okay. But it was very close. It was really weird sort of talking about it today. And the fascinating perhaps thing today is that now it's getting reprinted, because now the Swedish society is actually revisiting these things to sort of start again with this idea of a sort of the possibility of mobilization. We'll go back to conscription, etc. Okay, but this is also so the state prepares people to mobilize certain capabilities for resistance. But of course, this is also like the CIA manual that was dropped into Nicaragua, where the state encourages you or the people of Nicaragua to overthrow the Marxist state. If you look through this little manual that was sort of dropped into Nicaragua, it sort of starts with very simple resistance, and I think this is something we should all practice here at school, or at Parsons. You know, come late to work, call in sick with your martini in your hand, and these kind of things. You know, so it's on sort of a sliding scale. Then you call in and you start threatening your boss, or you sort of drop equipment and these kind of things. You can sort of choose which level of how much of your capabilities you want to mobilize. Then we come into the craft. It's actually quite tricky to clog up a bathroom, the toilet, you know, and sometimes you see it happening at school, and I'm sort of curious if they've read this manual or what is really going on there. But it's sort of, and then of course we come in the end to the Molotov cocktails and these kind of things. But there's basically sort of a sliding scale of engagement of how much capabilities and knowledge and forbidden knowledge is in that sense you want to mobilize against your enemy. Just on a parallel note, there's something happening here in the sense of what crafts, what arts are good arts versus bad arts in that sense. And there's a nice book by Carl Michael Edenborg, a Swedish researcher on alchemy, that is called The Shame of Alchemy. And he sort of, his argument there is that alchemy was never really disproved, but it was shamed out of existence because it was considered selfish. Because the rise of the new Enlightenment knowledge was that it was for public good, whereas the alchemic knowledges were all about me, producing my own gold, the philosopher's stone, etc., etc. So there was a sort of a discrepancy between what values the sciences, in that sense, were producing. So there's something interesting here in the sense of egoistic type of capabilities versus sort of a public good capabilities. Okay, so just sort of come into the hacking. What does this hacking thing mean? And to me, as I've sort of been looking at my old thesis, I sort of tried to sort of figure out that hacking is sort of a craft that is also having sort of some sort of systemic approach in that sense. The idea is that it not only sort of does IKEA thing, but it has sort of an idea that there's a sort of a black box that I'm opening. I'm trying to sort of subvert, I'm trying to sort of understand it and reclaim it. I'm not trying to sabotage it, but I'm trying to modify it in some sense. I usually use Gandhi's Salt March as perhaps a prime example of such a hack in that sense. It's a very democratic craft. Anybody can make the salt, but at the same time, of course, they make it illegal, and it's part of a mobilization structure against the British, and basically produces sort of the same salt. The liberated salt, grain of salt from the Indian Ocean is similar, or is the same, as the British produced salt, but it's detoxified from imperialism. And you touch your own independence. Or you have a model of liberated India in your hand as you produced your own salt, in that sense. So that's how extremely sort of democratic it could be as a mobilizing tool for sort of understanding what to do against a statecraft, which is then would be sort of the control of salt production. But sort of the connection to independence is, of course, making your own liquor is, of course, sort of a classic example of sort of a craft of liberation. And, of course, there's this classic book about Alcohol Republic, about, exactly how American independence, it was, fired up by the distillers, in that sense, because actually making your own liquor is the emblematic feeling of independence. And that's why you can buy them all on Amazon. Here is my field work. It's good if it's in Russian. This is from our summer still. And so this sort of end up and coming back to the Crystal Palace. Glenn Adamson starts the invention of craft with the picking of the Brahma lock at the Crystal Palace at the World Exhibit, the World Fair. Because what he argues here was that the British engineers who patented and made this sort of Brahma lock made it a challenge that you would get 200 guineas if you managed to pick the lock. And an American locksmith comes and does this. A former colonized subject sort of challenges the power of the British and outsmarts the British engineers that otherwise control and dominate all sort of industrial production of the world. But at that time, it's sort of the ingeniousness of hands manages to sort of manipulate the grand structure of thought. And this is something we try at home. My daughter is fascinated by this, so we have just started she's making her own manuals there. But sort of finish off, okay. It's great fun. Some of the most controlled spaces, coming back to prisons, are airports. And this is where sort of hacking comes to its sort of extreme. We're screened, we're having our passports controlled several times. So this is an interesting environment where Evan Booth tries to sort of figure out, to sort of challenge these laws which try to keep us unarmed onto airplanes. So he produces his weapons out of stuff that you can only buy in the souvenir store at the airport. So this is, of course, how you produce your own little, some sort of weapon, and of course they're also playing with this kind of idea of freedom, that this is kind of what capabilities you can mobilize. So here we have the chucks of liberty and the roll, yes, exactly. And of course the fridge magnets to sort of, whatever. So just to finish off, what sort of making are we thinking about? What does how do we sort of balance what sort of making we're thinking of. Is it only entrepreneurship we're going to be teaching in the Making Center in that sense? How can we sort of figure out what is this sort of freedom and potentiality that making has, and how does it connect to the other sort of political issues that are sort of generally discussed around the New School? And this, of course, ends up with fashion. That are we really going to support people to sew and learn to sew, or are we undermining our own future and our own students? Should we? I don't know exactly what we're going to do, and it's up for debate. But thank you very much. Okay.